in an extraordinary and unprecedented mistake.
I was absolutely stunned into the point of not really even knowing how to react.
The budget has been effectively leaked before it's been delivered by Rachel Reeves.
The sheer absurdity of reading out something that the Chancellor has not yet announced in the House of Commons.
Have you ever seen anything quite like it?
That was dramatic. That was a bit traumatic. I actually cannot believe what's just happened. Look at all the coverage, and everyone is talking about how unprecedented today's budget was. I'd probably go a bit further. I think it was completely shambolic. An hour before Rachel Reeves, took to the floor of the Commons to give her budget speech, the whole thing was accidentally leaked by the Office for Budget Responsibility. You might say, why does that matter? It was only an hour, we knew lots of these things were happening anyway. It's actually really important that the budget proper does not leak. James Heal and I were talking on our last episode of Reality Check about Hugh Dalton, who accidentally leaked a little bit of the budget and lost his job over it. This stuff really matters because it moves markets. People will have made trading decisions about this PDF that appeared online long before it should have. And that could have, made billions for people. It could have lost billions for others. And it affects us all because it affects the cost of borrowing in the gilt markets. So let's take a look at how the market reacted as it happened. Now, you can see from the graph we're showing of the market that it sort of fluctuated a bit. It went down, it shot up. But kind of once the measures sunk in, the market, in fairness to the Chancellor, seems to have reacted fairly well. The gilt yield, which affects our borrowing costs, as I say, is coming steadily down at the time we're recording this reality check. Well, why is that? It's because of the headroom, the margin of error that the Chancellor has managed to leave herself with at the end of this budget. After her first budget and after the spring statement, she left herself with just £9.9 billion margin of error. And that, rumours said, were quickly eroded by changes in the gilt market, by the cost of borrowing, by U-turns on policy measures. And in the run-up, we were reporting and we were briefed that this was going to leave her with a black hole of something like 20 to 30 billion pounds. Now, luckily for the Chancellor, that seems to have not actually materialised. And to everyone's shock, including mine, the dent to her headroom was only £6 billion, which is what has made it possible for her to get it back up to £22 billion, a much bigger margin, which seems to have given confidence to the markets. But she's got there in pretty difficult ways for all of us in the economy. She's done it with some pretty major tax rises that we'll discuss in a bit. But actually, inflation has bizarrely helped her too. The OBR are pretty clear that kind of offsetting the productivity downgrade that we were warned about for weeks and weeks, they've managed to take so much tax from workers because of inflation pushing up people's pay. And obviously, for the top workers, 40% of your income just goes straight to the tax man, that inflationary boost to pay has helped the Chancellor and meant her fiscal black hole was much smaller than originally thought. So let's look at the budget measures themselves. The headline today will be the shambolic leaking of the budget. I mean, make no mistake, someone in the Office for Budget Responsibility will lose their job over this. This just really is an unprecedented scandal. But if we ignore that and look for the headlines in what was leaked and what was then eventually announced in the House of Commons, for me, it's a benefits budget paid for by workers. We don't see any cuts to welfare spending. In fact, when we look at disability benefit spending, it's going to hit £109 billion. That's an increase of over £9 billion compared to where we were in the spring, which includes the U-turn on the winter fuel payment, the U-turns on the benefits cuts, and uprating of benefits. The government just seems to have given up on trying to solve the worklessness crisis. To pay for all that, she's using £26 billion of tax hikes. Now, that's going to take the tax as a share of GDP, what we call the tax burden, to a record high. to levels we've just not experienced since the Second World War. Now, she says she's not breaking her manifesto commitment because she's done this without touching the rates of the big free taxes. But I would say if she's not broken the letter of the manifesto commitment, she's certainly broken the spirit, because there's massive increases on tax on all of this. She's done this by extending the threshold freeze on income tax, so the point at which you start paying tax at all and the point that you go into higher tax brackets. She's keeping those flat, which means as inflation rises, as inflation pushes people's wages up, more people are going to get dragged into tax and into higher tax brackets. The OBR say it's going to result in an additional nearly 800,000 people who currently don't pay any tax paying tax at all. So it's, it's just ridiculous to claim that this is not a tax-raising budget on workers, because hundreds of thousands of people are going to be stung by these threshold freezes. In fact, if you look at the effect of these freezes since the Tories began them, it means over 5 million people either paying tax for the first time or paying them in higher brackets. We really are in a country that is just continually hiking tax. All of this has an effect on our borrowing costs, the big core problem at the heart of Britain's economy. And there was bad news there too. The spending measures and everything announced by Rachel Reeves, according to the OBR, is going to push this up, as the graph that I'm looking at now shows. We're going to be spending something like nearly £69 billion more on borrowing than had been originally forecast. And you and I'm afraid to say, are going to have to start paying for that. There's something interesting, though, about how she's put all the pieces together, how she's got the OBR to count her chickens. If you look at when these measures are set to come in, most of the spending increases will happen because they start this year or they start in the next financial year. But the tax increases that she's using to pay for them, many of them fall either in the year of the next election or the year just before. Now, can we really imagine that a Labour government, which so far at least is struggling in the polls, is going to go into the election year having to deliver these tax rises? So I think there has to be a degree of scepticism when we look at these OBR numbers. Has she sort of tricked the OBR with tax rises that she plans to not have to deliver so that she can make spending commitments now, to increase those benefits now, to scrap the two-child lock that pleases so many of her backbenchers that now control, unfortunately, I would say, almost everything she does? If the markets come to my view on that this is a bit of an accounting wheeze and that she doesn't really intend to deliver a lot of the tax rises that she's told the OBR she will, then we could see gilt yields going in the wrong direction quite quickly. If you remember when Labour were elected, they were pretty clear that growth was the most important thing. Everything this government did was going to be about growth, we were told. It's what they were to be judged on. Well, the OBR have been pretty clear today on that they're failing. They say that growth this year is revised upwards compared to their previous estimate, but for every subsequent year of the forecast, they've revised it down. So that means the measures that were leaked today, that Reeves announced today, are making us grow slower than we otherwise would have. And the most important one for me, inflation, the cost of living. In all of Reeves' briefing before the budget, she said that was going to be her focus. But again, she's failed. The OBR have upgraded their forecast for inflation both this year and next year. So she's making the cost of living worse, not better. Anyway, that's enough graphs and probably enough of me for this episode. So to continue the discussion, we're going to get into the politics with our political editor, Tim Shipman, and his deputy, James Heal. Tim and James, thanks for joining us. Now, we've all got incredibly excited about the full budget leaking, something that's never happened in this level of detail. Tim, are we overreacting?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I remember a few years ago when the Treasury briefed the Evening Standard some of the key measures in the budget, and it came out that morning. And there was absolute
sort of everything exploded. People were saying this is disgraceful, this is undermining democracy, you've got to announce it first in the House of Commons. And, this appears to be cock-up rather than conspiracy, but it does rather cap what has been the most turbulent pre-budget process I can remember in 25 years of doing political journalism. And these things can tend to be seen as symbolic of a government that's a bit adrift, that's having a lot of problems reconciling the economics and the politics. And this dropped like a stone an hour before the Chancellor stood up. And, she was chastised by the Deputy Speaker. It would have been quite entertaining if the Deputy Speaker had said, well, the budget's already out there. You can stick your speech in the library, sit down, and we'll hear straight away from the Leader of the Opposition. That's probably what the government deserved. They'll say it's not their fault, it's the OBR's fault. And I think they will try to find a way of easing out the head of the OBR, who they don't like anyway. But, this is just... it is totally unprecedented. In the olden days, this would have been a resignation matter for somebody. So we watch this space with interest.
And James, is there any way that this actually helps her a little bit? Because the Tories have been going after her for how much was briefed out before the budget, but this she can blame an independent organisation. It's nothing to do with her.
Yeah, certainly before she began her speech, Rachel Reeves did say that this is a mistake of the OBR. They've taken full responsibility for it. We've now had, since the budget, the chairman has gone out and made the statement and said that this was a technical mistake and it was their fault. But of course, I think the key thing, Michael, is the reaction of the gilt yields to all of this. And so I think Andrew Griffiths, the Shadow Business Secretary, was suggesting that somehow that it was getting the bad news out first before Rachel Reeves spoke, suggesting that investors wouldn't be watching her on the House of Commons floor and therefore blaming her for what went on. I think overall it was a mistake, though, clearly, because I think that it means that the key ace card of a budget speech is having the sole undivided attention of the House of Commons. That was lost, and I think throughout PMQs, you saw all MPs on all sides looking on their phones, glued to that, ignoring the questions going on around them. Rachel Reeves' speech actually wasn't particularly well listened to. You also then had a really sort of well-briefed Kemi Babe not giving her response. And afterwards, in the lobby questions, one of the Chancellor's aides did say actually that, a lot more detail than is normal. And of course, that's the thing. There's normally this information asymmetry where they have all the detail, whereas this time I think we had a few more hours to prepare and go over the books. So it made perhaps for a more briefed response than is normal at these budgets.
Well, it's made all our jobs a lot easier because we had...
Bravo.
Yeah, whoever did it at the OBR, thank you very much. The Spectator owes you a drink. But let's get into the actual measures. Tim, who's this budget for? Who are the winners and losers?
Oh, this budget is for Labour MPs to make them feel good about themselves. They're abandoning the two-child benefit cap. They're shoveling money into welfare. Spending is going up by just shy of £12 billion. And, there's a lot of detail that we can get into, but the big picture is this. A year ago, the Chancellor raised taxes by £40 billion, and she said, I won't have to come back and do it again. And she's had to come back and do it again. And it's instructive to look at the Labour Party manifesto from the last election. In there were the admission of £8.5 billion of tax rises. The Chancellor has now raised tax by £66 billion. All those warnings from Rishi Sunak and others about what a Labour government might bring were a catastrophic underestimate of what has happened. And, bluntly, mistakes have been made. Labour has talked down the economy. They've retarded growth. They've let inflation and unemployment rise. And not a lot of what's happened today is going to do a great deal to stop any of that. They got themselves in a political mess. And frankly, they've had to compromise dealing with our economic problems to deal with their political problems. And that's the shorthand of what's happened today.
This was the Klarna budget, which is borrow now, pay later. And if you look at the kind of pattern of the next 3 years of this Parliament, a lot of what the budget is presumpted on is actually going to have lots of borrowing costs rising over the next 2-3 years, and then in 2029 start paying the bills for all of this. And of course, that means I think that's going to be tested in the credibility. Officials are very much insistent that Rachel Reeves will actually get to the end of this Parliament and will be very much sticking to these promises laid out today. But actually, given the temptation of all governments, and also this government included in that, to kick the can down the road when it comes to 2028, 2029, entering election year, are we actually going to see the kind of cuts that we are sort of baked into these figures or not? And the likelihood is no.
But what is she hoping for? Because obviously she doesn't want to actually deliver these tax rises, but the numbers have to add up. Is she expecting a miracle by the end of the Parliament?
Well, I think that they hope that some of the kind of short to medium term things that have fueled the kind of uncertainty will go down. Inflation, of course. Higher inflation means you've then got to have higher spending on benefits, rising in line, 3.8%, higher than the sort of 2% she inherited under Rishi Sunak. But I think there is that case, Michael, which is that are we sort of governed on a wing and a prayer, which is that she's constantly talked about growth, and yet often her revealed preferences are very different from her stated ones, and doing things which are actively anti-growth. The Conservatives, for instance, are pretty annoyed by the fact that the OBR hasn't scored the employment rights bill. They argue that that's going to only lead to less growth in the future. And I think that, we had the briefing today and all the Chancellor was saying, of course, well, growth is up from 1 to 1.5% for the next year. Yes, but over the course of this Parliament, growth has been downgraded by the OBR. Yeah. So I think the bigger picture is one we've had for the last few years, which is that short to medium term, Chancellor's going to get through, they bluster through the sort of budget. And then after that, we just see the longer term picture getting worse and worse for the UK economy.
And this has been the pattern every year, for the last few years, and particularly since the budget last year, that no sooner is the ink dry than things come along and undermine it. And Rachel Reeves will say, look, I've been more responsible. I've created headroom of £22 billion rather than 9.9 billion. But that is still a rounding error, really, in the big scheme of things. And, as James was saying, once this employment rights thing kicks in, that could quite easily erode a decent chunk of that. And in recent days as well, we've been seeing ministers, including Reeves, mutter about support for Ukraine and needing to support the armed forces at this time. There's not a single extra penny for the military.
And you had an exclusive on that when we were in the Spectator war room about the military's response.
Yeah, I'm sort of sitting there watching the budget, and someone who ought to know told me there was a meeting yesterday of the defence chiefs. They kicked all their aides and the civil servants out of the room and sat around and agreed that they needed to write to the Defence Secretary to say that the Strategic Defence Review is no longer deliverable on the current budget. Either we need more money more quickly, or you can start thinking about cutting kit and people again. Now, this seems to have blindsided the Ministry of Defence. This letter has not yet been sent, but that is another thing that, given the noises that the Prime Minister has had to make about all this, and given that the President of the United States is watching defence spending very closely and keen to see Britain contribute its share and fill the gap that the Americans are evacuating to a degree in the defence of Europe. This is, already, even on the day, yet another potential burden on the public finances that, is going to erode that £22 billion pretty fast, I suspect.
And James, how do you think the public's going to react to all this? I mean, are they happy with their taxes going up to just pay for endless benefits increases?
I think that if you're in the Labour Party, there are some elements of this budget you'll really cheer. And speaking to the MPs in the last week or so, I spoke to one MP who told me that there was only one person in the entire parliamentary party they could find who actually supported the two-child benefit cap in principle. I mean, others have supported it because out of need of pragmatism. But it was a really unpopular policy. Over on Blue Sky, a lot of Labour MPs are delighted by this, talking about child poverty rates, etc. They're very happy about it. But I do think there is lots of space for Labour's enemy as a result of this budget. To give you one example, 1.8 billion has been set aside for the headline pledge to introduce digital ID, which both the Liberal Democrats and Reform have seized upon, because this money is so-called unfunded, which means the Home Office is going to have to divert some of the money, which has already been suffering some budget cuts, the Home Office, away from border control into digital ID. That's going to play very well with those parties. For the Conservatives, of course, people like Nick Timothy are already pointing out the two-child benefit cap. How many of those people who are going to be having these extra families are going to be those with one or two foreign-born parents? And what does that mean? So I think that there is really potential here where lots of different groups are going to be annoyed by these changes. You think in the South East, the housing changes will particularly pay effect. I'll be interested to see what effect that has on sort of the London Borough Council elections next year. But I do think that this thing about welfare going up continually and up 16 billion in less than a year in terms of projected costs means that actually I think the kind of the savers versus the strivers and narrative can certainly play in the future.
Yeah, and Labour still thinks it's the party of the working classes. Actually, of course, it's the party of the metropolitan elites for the most part. The working classes are the people who are most offended by rising welfare because they're going off to work and they're seeing people getting huge amounts of money. And as James says, I mean, those figures on 341,000 foreign-born families could benefit from the extra child benefit cap. And which is top of the list? Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nigeria, Somalia. I think one of the problems is we still don't have a coherent narrative from this government. As James was saying, they say their top priority is growth, and then they do a load of things which are completely contrary to that. The Home Secretary gets a lot of publicity and supportive, media coverage for a crackdown on migration and needing to make it more difficult for foreign nationals coming here to claim benefits. And then the budget comes along and promptly shovels them huge amounts of cash. The amount of money that's being spent on asylum seekers is, I forget the specific numbers, but it's soaring, like sort of up 50% or something in this budget. And these figures on foreign-born nationals who are going to benefit from the child benefit cap, that's a very stark thing. They think they've been clever by not raising the basic the sort of headline rates of income tax, which I think would potentially have been a totally catastrophic move. But by freezing the thresholds for longer, the figures again, 1 in 4 people in the tax system is going to be a higher or advanced rate taxpayer by the end of the decade. And that is up from 15% at the start of the decade. So that's a huge increase. And the people who will be sucked into paying those higher rates of tax are precisely the kind of people that Labour normally looks after. The nurses, the teachers, the policemen, the kind of people who, are working hard, probably double income families and all the rest of it, who are trying to make ends meet, and they're going to suddenly be paying 40p tax as a result of all of this. So, we spent a long time under the coalition pulling people out of paying higher rate tax who'd been sucked into it over the previous decade, and Labour is now repeating exactly the same trick that Gordon Brown pulled by sucking them all back into it again. So, these will be things that are noticed in people's pay packets. It may not get the headlines that whacking 2p on income tax would do, but, there's that fundamental thing in politics. It's the economy stupid, as James Carville said, Bill Clinton's main theorist. Ronald Reagan said, "Are you better off than you were 4 years ago?" And that was his election slogan. Almost nobody, as a result of this budget, is going to be, even the people that Reeves is trying to protect, are going to be able to say by the time of the next election that they're better off than they were at the time of the last election. And that is a very, very difficult political environment for any party seeking to get back in.
Finally, before we all disappear back into budget world, I'll ask you both to make a prediction. Will we see another Rachel Reeves budget?
On balance, yes, because I think the Labour Party is pretty inept at removing its leaders. And I think if Keir Starmer survives, I think Rachel Reeves will as well, because offloading her would be tantamount to shooting one of his own feet off. I say that only very cautiously, because there are clearly a whole bunch of scenarios in which both of them go. And if Labour has a catastrophic time at the local elections in May, anything is possible. But I'm now an increasingly cautious old man who is not carried away with plots and everything like I used to be in my younger years. Now, Mr. Heel is a little younger than I am. He may give you the opposite.
Give us a
prediction.
spicier take, James.
I think it's 50-50. I think that...
I think it's 51-49.
Well, she stays?
Well, let's call it the classic British scenario, 52-48, that she stays.
I think, yeah.
But it's pretty much a coin flip.
I think if you're going to change the leader, then you change some of the choices that have been made, and I think that's your one moment to do so. So I think the key thing comes after May next year when we get through the locals, and then the calculation for the Labour Party will be we've only got one chance to change the leader of this Parliament. We can't do a kind of Liz Truss sort of change leaders twice without an election. So I think that if Keir Starmer is there in 12 months' time, so will Rachel Reeves. But of course, if Starmer goes, then I think that will be the chance to get Reeves as well, because they are tied up. There isn't a kind of independent economic policy. You haven't got a kind of Alan Walters, Thatcher-style split here.
They are lashed to the same mast, and if the mast falls, they will both fall with it.
Tim and James, thank you for joining Reality Check.